In 1925, there was a big storm. An awful lot of ships in Placentia Bay were lost because the water here in Placentia Bay is very deep. Boats get lost and you never hear tell them again. My husband went out, it would be 60 miles across the bay. He thought he saw a man hanging from the cross trees. The storm was still on and he got all his friends, around to go out to sea. They cut the rope that held him. They didn't know who he was. Put on dry clothes on him and fixed him up, and they left him in the courthouse to be identified. They got a clothes bag. We got in the pocket a little mouth organ, and in another one his identification card. My name is Joshua Barrett. I belong to Woody Island, Placentia Bay. I wrote to the nearest relative, and about 2 weeks after we got a letter. The woman said, the clothes bag belonged to our dear boy, she said. He went with his uncle, Cape St. Mary's, that summer for one little trip, and that's all ever we heard.
The history of the fishery, why these fortifications were built. And I grew up here running down the old French trail. And Port Royal was constructed by the French in 1693. The events that happened in Europe and Treaty of Utrecht signed over to the English. Castle Hill has a military history. There wasn't just soldiers and forts. I mean, it was a full-fledged community.
The Ardente ferry service has been here since 1967. Seasonal service, the beginning of July, the end of September, with 2 crossings a week, Monday, and she will be in on Thursday.
I heard about the fish over here, so I'm going to see how much fish is on the go and what the weather is like, and if it works out, I'll move the boat over, yeah.
Well, we haven't seen too much here yet because the fog, We drove from in St. Mary's and fish plant, and I hardly saw land.
20,000-30,000, the fellas brings in more, and more brings in less that way, like. There's fellas have more than that. I don't mind the fog, that's the kind of weather we like.
Cape St. Mary's Ecological Reserve. At its center is an isolated sea stack, bird rock, surrounded by the rich waters of the North Atlantic. The largest species that nest on these cliffs are the northern gannets, the first to arrive and last to leave. Gannet pairs reunite at the reserve in March, having spent the winter apart, foraging as far south as the Gulf of Mexico. And each summer, they return here to breed. Northern gannets are monogamous. It remains a mystery how they find each other among the thousands of nests and tens of thousands of birds that have gathered. But each year, they do. They return to the same nesting spot, renewing a relationship that could be over a decade long. In June, the first chicks hatch. It will take 13 weeks for this fuzzy chick to grow and transform into a sleek juvenile. Each parent takes turns leaving the nest, seeking shoals of fish, sometimes over 100 kilometers away. By September, surrounded by other nests, this chick outweighs its parents. Feathers have replaced its downy fuzz, providing the needed waterproof protection for its life at sea. As chicks begin to outgrow their nests, fights break out amongst neighbors defending their territories. It's a tense time, and the dynamics of the colony shift with the changing season. The chick joins thousands of others as a new instinct takes hold: the urge to fly. They are strengthening flight muscles that will soon be put to the test, waiting for the right conditions for their first flight. Because each chick will get just one chance to fly, one chance to make it to the sea. It's October when this moment arrives. Chicks across Bird Rock begin to move towards the edge of the cliffs, preparing to take flight. Looking to the horizon, the chick flaps its wings in escalating tempo and vigor until, without warning, chicks that don't master this first flight will likely perish in the surf below. Only 1/3 will survive their first year at sea as they learn to hunt on their own. These juveniles have begun a journey that may bring them back to Cape St. Mary's and Bird Rock after up to 3 years at sea. After their young depart, the adults turn their attention to one another. Many will linger at Bird Rock with their mates for a few weeks before leaving on their own migration south. And the reserve will be here for their return.
I seen it all rise and fall, now the fishing stocks are gone. It's a different way of life, but we'll go on. We face the icy winds and cold out on the northern sea, where the cod stocks made a living once for me.
The most conspicuous ones are the gannets, and there's about 11,000 gannets here. And then there's about 21,000 murres and kittiwakes, and those are the three largest numbers of breeders here. And there's also some guillemots and razorbills. And it is the second largest colony in North America. And the two adults, they'll share the parent care for the next 13 weeks, and then the chicks will be ready to leave. And they'll leave on their own without the parents' help. The gannets, they're called plunge divers. They'll drop out of the sky like from 30 feet or more and just drop right on a fish and then bounce back up and have it in the back of their throat.
I remember years ago when men they made their daily catch with the cod tongues from the heads of fish we'd snatch. For a buck a pound we'd all go down close by the water's edge, and we wait for skulls to fall down from the ledge. And if I stare out long enough over the mist upon the bay, I can still see men in the morning sail away. I believe I see a vision in my dreams from on this rock, rise from the seas like ghosts out in the fog. Now time moves on, our lives did change. Some friends we'll see no more as we boarded up the windows and the door. And we stare once more at an empty shore where Cape used to raise, and we leave for good, the tears roll down our face. And if I stare out long enough over the mist upon the bay, I can still see men in the morning sail away. I believe I see a vision in my dreams from on this rock, rise from the seas like ghosts out in the fog. The years they drift behind us and the dreams we have are gone, and we realize it's time now to move on. Like an ember from the chimney of a wood stove, time it flies and it fades away like stars up in the sky. And if I stare out long enough over the mist upon the bay, I can still see men in the morning sail away. I believe I see a vision in my dreams from on this rock, rise from the seas like ghosts out in the fog. And if I stare out long enough over the mist upon the bay, I can still see men in the morning sail away. I believe I see a vision in my dreams from on this rock, rise from the seas like ghosts out in the fog. They rise from the seas like ghosts out in the fog.
March 1897, a 22-year-old Guglielmo Marconi stood in front of a crowd of high-ranking officers, and he had promised to show them communication without wires.
He was a practical inventor who wanted to be commercially successful.
An aerial held up by a balloon, the signal could be transmitted further than ever before, and the military would be an obvious customer.
A key starts the process, a big spark. When that spark happens, that energy via this wire all the way up the antenna, and it radiates into space in all directions. The longer the wire we have up, the stronger the signal we get at the receiver. The fundamental basis of all radio communication.
At about 5 o'clock in the afternoon of July 8th, a pile of hay caught fire in a small barn at the corner of Freshwater and Pennywell roads. The fire spread quickly. The wooden houses that lined the streets into tinder boxes. A strong wind carried the flames. A large water tank meters from the barn was almost empty. Earlier that morning, the water supply shut off to install new pipes. Its 20 miles of pipes would not be filled again until 1 hour after the fire broke out. The flames grew east and south.
When I saw that it had burst into Water Street and was sending out great flakes of fire and tornadoes of fiery particles while a solid mass of fire steadily advanced, I knew then that the city was doomed. I began to think of my own home in Devon Row, and for the first time realized that in all probability it would be included in the general destruction.
Some ran to the harbor, desperate to get in a ship. Others headed for higher ground. Families stashed their valuables in the stone and brick buildings that they thought would survive the fire.
Consternation now seized the populace. They saw with terror that the stone edifices were no more able to resist the attacks of the fire than the flimsiest wooden structures. All the arteries which led from the water to the higher portions of the town were crowded with the terrorized mob, and the screams and cries of the women mingled with the wailing of children. The shouts intensified by the masses of livid fire and the glare of the burning buildings.
Most people made it to safe ground. They camped out at Bannerman Park and the few other patches of land outside the fire's reach.
The next morning I took a walk around the awful scene of devastation. It was heartrending. Nothing visible for a mile from Devon Row but chimneys and fallen tottering walls. The thick smoke from the smoldering ruins still filled the air. It made the heart ache to see the groups of men, women, and children with weary, bloodshot eyes and smoke-begrimed faces, standing over their scraps of furniture and clothing, some of them asleep on the ground from utter exhaustion.
In a city of 30,000 people, 11,000 were now homeless. The government had to act fast. Tents sprang up at Kitty Vitty and wooden sheds at Bannerman Park. Food and clothing were distributed daily. The steamship Blake arrived from Halifax with food, tents, and other provisions.
So work, boys, work and be contented, as long as there's enough to buy a meal. For a man you can rely, he'll be wealthy by and by, if he only puts his shoulder to the wheel. I am not a wealthy man, though I've come upon a plan to make myself as happy as a king. And if you will allow, I will tell it to you now. Poor time, you know it's always on the wing. So work, boys, work and be contented, as long as there's enough to buy a meal. For a man you can rely, he'll be wealthy by and by, if he only puts his shoulder to the wheel.
Across North America and Britain, more than $350,000 paid for the lumber, glass, nails, and other construction materials that would help St. John's rebuild. 400 new homes were underway by September. 1,000 more soon followed. Most were wooden. With winter coming, there was no time or money to build brick homes. Only stone or brick structures were allowed on Water Street and on much of Duckworth and George Streets. Some roads were widened and straightened, but there was not enough money to rebuild the city on a grid pattern. Most of the rebuilding was finished in 2 years, but it was a decade before the Anglican Cathedral was completed. The building did not burn down. The fire's western boundary. Their peaked roofs are typical of 19th century stone construction. After the fire, flat roofs became popular because they could be built quickly and cheaply. One of the many marks that the 1892 Great Fire has left on the city it burned down more than a century ago.
Discontented people say that all work and little play will make a boy a blockhead as a rule. Well, you can answer them and say that no work can always play will make him both a blockhead and a fool. So work, boys, work and be contented, as long as there's enough to buy a meal. For a man you can rely, he'll be wealthy by and by, if he only puts his shoulder to the wheel. So work, buys a work and be contented, as long as there's enough to buy a meal. For a man you can rely, he'll be wealthy by and by, if he only puts his shoulder to the wheel.